Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. For today's episode, I will be looking at Psychology, a Briefer Course by William James. And this is the condensed version of his larger book, Principles of Psychology, which was actually 2 volumes. And the original one, Principles of Psychology, was released in 1890, and this abridged 1-volume version came out 2 years later in 1892. So this is old school psychology, and yet a lot of it, not all of it, but a lot of it has not been refuted. This is not like the whole thing is just completely outdated. That's not the case at all. And there's a few important things about this book, I think, that I want to look at. So this is William James's first major work. And William James is basically the forefather of pragmatism, or the father, I should say, of pragmatism. And this is one of his very early works. And you can see in here he's beginning to lay the foundations for what would later become pragmatism. I reviewed his other book, Pragmatism, early on in my podcast. And this is the second book of his I'm reviewing, jumping back to this early work. So you can see the foundations of what would later become his book, Pragmatism, in here in this work. Because he's been discussing these ideas with his friend Charles Peirce for years before he put out the book Pragmatism. And Peirce has a share in the creation of the idea of pragmatism. And so this was already an ongoing discussion when he put this book out. So that's one thing that's important about this book, is this like early beginnings of pragmatic philosophy. But another thing that is interesting about it is it's like the first main widely used psychology textbook that was like the psychology textbook for an entire generation. And it's like evolutionary psychology, really. He talks about Charles Darwin, and he frames the psychological insights of this book within an evolutionary... he doesn't spend the whole book talking about evolution and Darwin. It's not a book on evolutionary psychology per se, but it's a book on psychology where he multiple times references back the theory of evolution and applies it to, although not necessarily pointed out, he really does apply evolutionary theory to his entire book. And so as a sort of birth of evolutionary psychology, I would point to this right here. And the third thing that I think that we can see is that there's some amount of conservatism in this book. I think of the early pragmatists, William James was the most conservative. And you can see that in various parts of this book. Now, again, it's not a book on conservative theory. It's essentially a psychology textbook, as textbooks were back then. It's not really similar to a textbook today, but you can see he has some conservative ideas that come through here. And whereas later, as we'll see in future books, many of the pragmatists definitely veer off in a leftward direction, kind of led by John Dewey. But James, as the originator and the father of the theory, really is a little bit more on the conservative side, I would say. And it's going to be sort of an exploration that we'll be undertaking in upcoming episodes to look at, where pragmatic philosophy has been used to bolster conservative arguments. So, like all my podcast episodes, I'm going to read some sections out of this book. Actually, quite a few. I think I'll probably be reading like 9 or 10 sections. This might be a longer episode, but that's okay. This is an important book for us to look at. So I'm going to read some sections, and I'm going to comment on what I've read and apply it to some of the other books that I've read so we can kind of fit this into the grand narrative. Let's start here. I think I'll just go through this consecutively, starting at the beginning of the book and moving on from there, because the book sort of, develops its themes. And one of the early things that he says, this is on page 17, so it's actually, that's counting all of these other, it's actually really like page 3 of Chapter 1. He says the following, quote, "Mental facts cannot be properly studied apart from the physical environment of which they take cognizance. The great fault of the older rational psychology was to set up the soul as an absolute spiritual being, with certain faculties of its own, by which the several activities of remembering, imagining, reasoning, willing, etc. were explained, almost without reference to the peculiarities of the world with which these activities deal. But the richer insight of modern days perceives that our inner faculties are adapted, in advance, to the features of the world in which we dwell. Adapted, I mean, so as to secure our safety and prosperity in its midst. Not only are our capacities for forming new habits, for remembering sequences, and for abstracting general properties from things, and associating their usual consequences with them, exactly the faculties needed for steering us in this world of mixed variety and uniformity. But our emotions and instincts are adapted to very special features of that world. In the main, if a phenomenon is important for our welfare, it interests and excites us the first time we come into its presence. Dangerous things fill us with involuntary fear, poisonous things with distaste, indispensable things with appetite. Mind and world, in short, have been evolved together, and in consequence are something of a mutual fit. The special interactions between the outer order and the order of consciousness, by which this harmony, such as it is, may, in the course of time, have come about, have been the subject of many evolutionary speculations, which, though they cannot be so far be said to be conclusive, have at least refreshed and enriched the whole subject, and brought all sorts of new questions to the light. The chief result of all this more modern view is the gradually growing conviction that mental life is primarily teleological. That is to say that our various ways of feeling and thinking have grown to be what they are because of their utility in shaping our reactions on the outer world. On the whole, few recent formulas have done more service in psychology than the Spencerian one that the essence of mental life and bodily life are one, namely the adjustment of inner to outer relations. The adjustment is to immediately present objects in lower animals and in infants. It is to objects more and more remote in time and space, and inferred by means of more and more complex and exact processes of reasoning, when the grade of mental development grows more advanced. Primarily, then, and fundamentally, the mental life is for the sake of action of a preservative sort. Secondarily and incidentally, it does many other things, and may even, when ill-adapted, lead to its possessor's destruction. Psychology, taken in the widest way, ought to study every sort of mental activity, the useless and harmful sorts, as well as that which is adapted. But the study of the harmful in mental life has been made the subject of a special branch called psychiatry, the study of insanity, and the study of the useless is made over to aesthetics. He goes on to say, quote, "The immediate condition of a state of consciousness is an activity of some sort in the cerebral hemispheres. This proposition is supported by so many pathological facts and laid by physiologists at the base of so many of their reasonings that to the medically educated mind it seems almost axiomatic. It would be hard, however, to give any short and peremptory proof of the unconditional dependence of mental action upon neural change. That a general and usual amount of dependence exists cannot possibly be ignored. One has only to consider how quickly consciousness may be, so far as we know, abolished by a blow on the head, by rapid loss of blood, or by an epileptic discharge, or by a full dose of alcohol, opium, ether, or nitrous oxide, or how easily it may be altered, in quality, by a smaller dose of any of these agents or of others, or by a fever, or to see how at the mercy of bodily happenings our spirit is. A little stoppage of the gall duct, a swallow of cathartic medicine, a cup of strong coffee at the proper moment will entirely overturn, for the time, a man's views of life. Our moods and resolutions are more determined by the condition of our circulation than by our logical grounds. Whether a man shall be a hero or a coward is a matter of his temporary nerves. In many kinds of insanity, though by no means in all, distinct alterations of the brain tissue have been found. Destruction of certain definite portions of the cerebral hemispheres involves losses of memory and of acquired motor faculty of quite determinate sorts, to which we shall revert again under the title of aphasias. Taking all such facts together, the simple and radical conception draws upon the mind that the mental action may be uniformly and absolutely a function of brain action, varying as the latter varies, and being to the brain action as effect to cause. End quote. So that's right in the beginning, in the introduction. He's saying that all mental activity is directly correlated to neurological activity, to material activity occurring in the brain, that the brain, and the body are designed to operate together, that the brain is fit, the mind is fit, the instincts are fit directly to the external world, that we're not sort of like minds on our own interacting with the world, but that we in the world developed together, we evolved together. So the mind and the mind's experience are both mechanical processes. The mind is a basically biological machine. The brain is a biological machine, and it grows and changes and interacts in its structure with the external world, which changes the shape of the conscious mind. So I think that's an interesting thing that he's laid that out pretty clearly early on, and I think this draws a connection between that we'll follow up on in additional books, and that we've seen in past books, this connection between evolutionary theory, evolutionary psychology, and philosophical pragmatism. So moving on from here, he talks later on, this is chapter 10. He talks a lot about like the senses, the eyes, and the brain, and the biology of everything. And I'm not going to get too into the physiology of everything, but I want to point to where he talks about habit here in chapter 10 about habit. He says, quote, "Habit has a physical basis. The moment one tries to define what habit is, one is led to the fundamental properties of matter. The laws of nature are nothing but the immutable habits which the different elementary sorts of matter follow in their actions and reactions upon each other. In the organic world, however, the habits are more variable than this. Even instincts vary from one individual to another of a kind, and are modified in the same individual, as we shall later see, to suit the exigencies of the case. On the principles of the atomistic philosophy, the habits of an elementary particle of matter cannot change, because the particle is itself an unchangeable thing. But those of a compound mass of matter can change, because they are, in the last instance, due to the structure of the compound, and either outward forces or inward tensions can, from one hour to another, turn that structure into something different from what it was. That is, they can do so if the body be plastic enough to maintain its integrity and not be disrupted when its structure yields. The change of structure here spoken of need not involve the outward shape. It may be invisible and molecular, as when a bar of iron becomes magnetic or crystalline through the action of certain outward causes, or India rubber becomes friable, or plaster sets. All these changes are rather slow. The material in question opposes a certain resistance to the modifying cause, which it takes time to overcome, but the gradual yielding whereof often saves the material from being disintegrated altogether. When the structure has yielded, the same inertia becomes a condition of its comparative performance in the new form, and of the new habits the body then manifests. Plasticity, then, in the wide sense of the word, means the possession of a structure weak enough to yield to an influence, but strong enough not to yield all at once. Each relatively stable phase of equilibrium in such a structure is marked by what we may call a new set of habits. Organic matter, especially nervous tissue, seems endowed with a very extraordinary degree of plasticity of this sort, so that we may without hesitation lay down as our first proposition the following: that the phenomena of habit in living beings are due to the plasticity of the organic materials of which their bodies are composed. The philosophy of habit is thus, in the first instance, a chapter in physics, rather than physiology or psychology. That it is at bottom a physical principle is admitted by all good recent writers on the subject. They call attention to analogues of acquired habits exhibited by dead matter. Thus, Leon M. Dumont writes, "Everyone knows how a garment, after having been worn a certain time, clings to the shape of the body better than when it was new. There has been a change in the tissue, and this change is a new habit of cohesion. A lock works better after being used some time. At the outset, more force was required to overcome certain roughness in the mechanism. The overcoming of their resistance is a phenomena of habituation. It costs less trouble to fold a paper when it has been folded already. And just so in the nervous system. The impressions of outer objects fashion for themselves more and more appropriate paths. And these vital phenomena recur under similar excitements from without when they have been interrupted a certain time." Not in the nervous system alone. A scar anywhere is a locus minoris resistentiae, more liable to be abraded, inflamed, to suffer pain and cold than our neighboring parts. A sprained ankle, a dislocated arm, are in danger of being sprained or dislocated again. Joints that have once been attacked by rheumatism or gout, mucous membranes that have been the seat of catarrh, are, with each fresh recurrence, more prone to a relapse, until often the morbid state chronically substitutes itself for the sound one. And in the nervous system itself, it is well known how many so-called functional diseases seem to keep themselves going simply because they happen to have once begun, and how the forcible cutting short by medicine of a few attacks is often sufficient to enable the physiological forces to get possession of the field again and to bring the organs back to functions of health. Epilepsies, neuralgias, convulsive affections of various sorts, insomnias, are so many cases in point. And, to take what are more obviously habits, the success with which a weaning treatment can often be applied to the victims of unhealthy indulgence of passion or of more complaining or irascible disposition shows us how much more the morbid manifestations themselves were due to the mere inertia of the nervous organs when once launched on a false career. Habits are due to pathways through the nerve centers. If habits are due to the plasticity of materials to outward agents, we can immediately see to what outward influences, if to any, the brain matter is plastic. Not to mechanical pressures, not to thermal changes, not to any of the forces to which on all the other organs of our body are exposed, for, as we saw, nature has so blanketed and wrapped the brain about that the only impressions that can be made upon it are through the blood on the one hand and the sensory nerve roots on the other. And it is to the infinitely attenuated currents that pour in through these latter channels that the hemispherical cortex shows itself to be so peculiarly susceptible. The currents, once in, must find a way out. In getting out, they leave their traces in the paths which they take. The only thing they can do, in short, is to deepen old paths or to make new ones. And the whole plasticity of the brain sums itself up in two words when we call it an organ in which currents pouring in from the sense organs make with extreme facility paths which do not easily disappear. For of course a simple habit, like every other nervous event, the habit of snuffling, for example, or of putting one's hands into one's pockets or biting one's nails, is mechanically nothing but a reflex discharge, and its anatomical substratum must be a path in the system. The most complex habits, as we shall presently see more fully, are from the same point of view nothing but concatenated discharges in the nerve centers, due to the presence there of systems of reflex paths, so organized as to wake each other up successively, the impression produced by one muscular contraction serving as a stimulus to provoke the next until a final impression inhibits the process and closes the chain. End quote. All right, so that was all about habit. And his argument that habit is really a physical condition of the matter of the brain, or of any matter for that matter. The structure of a thing determines its habits. If the structure of a thing allows for change, allows for the structure to change without the integrity of the object or the integrity of the structure itself being compromised, then that is considered plasticity. And he's talking about the brain's plasticity and the structure of the brain to be changed, the physical structure of the brain to be changed by external inputs. Those external inputs being specifically the blood flow to the brain and the sensory inputs through our eyes and senses of touch and so on. And as nerve impulses come into the mind, as mental processes begin, they're tracing neural paths, they're tracing structures in the brain, and those pathways of neural activity solidify through repeated use, and your mind automatically follows those neural pathways repeatedly, and that's the basis for habit, for what habit is. So again, he brings this to a very materialistic understanding of human behavior. And as he talks more about habit, he says the following. He says, quote, "Habit is the enormous flywheel of society, its most precious conservative agent. It alone is what keeps us all within the bounds of ordinance, and saves the children of fortune from the envious uprisings of the poor. It alone prevents the hardest and most repulsive walks of life from being deserted by those brought up to tread therein. It keeps the fisherman and the deckhand at sea through the winter. It holds the miner in his darkness and nails the countryman to his log cabin and his lonely farm through all the months of snow. It protects us from invasion by the natives of the desert and the frozen zone. It dooms us all to fight out the battle of life upon the lines of our nurture or our early choice, and to make the best of a pursuit that disagrees because there is no other for which we are fitted, and it is too late to begin again. It keeps different social strata from mixing. Already at the age of 25 you see the professional mannerism settling down on the young commercial traveler, or the young doctor, or the young minister, or the young counselor at law. You see the little lines of cleavage running through the character, the tricks of thought, the prejudices, the ways of the shop, from which man can by and by no more escape than his coat sleeve can suddenly fall into a new set of folds. On the whole, it is best he should not escape. It is well for the world that in most of us, by the age of 30, the character has set like plaster, and will never soften again. If the period between 20 and 30 is the critical one in the formation of intellectual and professional habits, the period below 20 is still more important for the fixing of personal habits, properly so called, such as vocalization and pronunciation, gesture, motion, and address. Hardly ever is a language learned after 20 spoken without a foreign accent. Hardly ever can a youth transferred to the society of his betters unlearn the nasality and other vices of speech bred in him by the associations of his growing years. Hardly ever, indeed, no matter how much money there be in his pocket, can he ever learn to dress like gentlemen born. The merchants offer their wares as eagerly to him as to the veriest swell, but he simply cannot buy the right things. An invisible law as strong as gravitation keeps him within his orbit, arrayed this year as he was the last, and how his better-clad acquaintances contrive to get the things they wear will be for him a mystery till his dying day. The great thing, then, in all education is to make our nervous system our ally instead of our enemy. It is to fund and capitalize our acquisitions, and to live at ease upon the interest of the fund. For this we must make automatic and habitual, as early as possible, as many useful actions as we can, and guard against the growing into ways that are likely to be disadvantageous to us, as we should guard against the plague. The more of the details of our daily life we can hand over to the effortless custody of automation, the more our higher powers of mind will be set free for their own proper work. There is no more miserable human being than one in whom nothing is habitual but indecision, and for whom the lighting of every cigar, the drinking of every cup, the time of rising and going to bed every day, and the beginning of every bit of work are subjects of express volitional deliberation. Full half the time of such a man goes to the deciding, or regretting, of matters which ought to be so ingrained in him as practically not to exist for his consciousness at all. If there be such daily duties not yet ingrained in any one of my readers, let him begin this very hour to set the matter right." End quote. So you see there, it's sort of, he gives this sort of little advice for people. He scatters these throughout this book, little bits of advice for his readers. And that one is, I think, fairly well known, actually. The bit of advice that he gives about building habits and how important habits are, and how once you get past a certain age, you can't make new habits. And he talks about how these hold society together by creating social roles and getting people acclimated to filling their social roles, and allows society and culture basically to keep from being in a constant state of chaos, to make sure that there are things that nobody wants to do, but those things still get done because they're acclimated. The people who do them are acclimated to doing them. These are the sort of things that keep society functional. And they're built on habit, and it's built on neural pathways. And but he talks about how good it is for the listener. By the time you should be acquiring your habits as strongly as soon as possible. You don't want to be the person beset by constant indecision regarding things that should be so ingrained in you that it doesn't take up any mental energy at all. And your mental energy can be freed from the constant deciding of things which ought to be habitual, and can be freed for other greater purposes. And I think that's interesting, and he makes a good point. He talks a bit more about habit as well. I'm actually covering a lot of the section of habit because I think it's pretty cool. But he talks more about habit later on in this chapter. He says, quote, "It is not in the moment of their forming, but in the moment of their producing motor effects, that resolves and aspirations communicate the new set to the brain. As Professor Bain remarks, the actual presence of the practical opportunity alone furnishes the fulcrum upon which the lever can rest, by means of which the moral may multiply its strength and raise itself aloft. He who has no solid ground to press against will never get beyond the stage of empty gesture-making. No matter how full a reservoir of maxims one may possess, no matter how good one's sentiments may be, if one have not taken advantage of every concrete opportunity to act, one's character may remain entirely unaffected for the better. With mere good intentions, hell is proverbially paved. And this is an obvious consequence of the principles we have laid down. A character, as John Stuart Mill says, is a completely fashioned will, and a will, in the sense in which he means it, is an aggregate of tendencies to act in a firm and prompt and definite way upon all the principal emergencies of life. A tendency to act only becomes effectively ingrained in us in proportion to the uninterrupted frequency with which the actions actually occur, and the brain grows to their use. When a resolve or a fine glow of feeling is allowed to evaporate, without bearing practical fruit, it is worse than a chance lost. It works so as to positively hinder future resolutions and emotions from taking the normal path of discharge. There is no more contemptible type of human character than that of the nerveless sentimentalist and dreamer, who spends his life in a weltering sea of sensibility and emotion, but who never does a manly, concrete deed. Rousseau, inflaming all the mothers of France by his eloquence to follow nature and nurse their babies themselves, while he sends his own children to the foundling hospital, is the classical example of what I mean. But every one of us, in his measure, whenever, after glowing for an abstractly formulated good, he practically ignores some actual case among the squalid other particulars of which that same good lurks disguised, treads straight on Rousseau's path. All goods are disguised by the vulgarity of their concomitants in this workaday world, but woe to him who can only recognize them when he thinks them in their pure and abstract form. The habit of excessive novel reading and theater-going will produce true monsters in this line. The weeping of the Russian lady over the fictitious personages in the play, while her coachman is freezing to death in his seat outside, is the sort of thing that everywhere happens on a less glaring scale. Even the habit of excessive indulgence in music for those who are neither performers themselves nor musically gifted enough to take it in a purely intellectual way has probably a relaxing effect upon character. one becomes filled with emotions, which habitually pass without prompting to any deed, and so the inertly sentimental condition is kept up. The remedy would be never to suffer oneself to have an emotion at a concert without expressing it afterward in some active way. Let the expression be the least thing in the world. Speaking genially to one's grandmother or giving up one's seat in a horse car, if nothing more heroic offers. But let it not fail to take place. These latter cases make us aware that it is not simply particular lines of discharge, but also general forms of discharge that seem to be grooved out by habit in the brain. Just as if we let our emotions evaporate, they get into a way of evaporating. So there is reason to suppose that if we often flinch from making an effort, before we know it, the effort-making capacity will be gone, and that, if we suffer the wandering of our attention, presently it will wander all the time. Attention and effort are, as we shall see later, but two names for the same psychic fact. To what brain processes they correspond, we do not know. The strongest reason for believing that they do depend on brain processes at all, and are not pure acts of the spirit, is just this fact, that they seem in some degree subject to the laws of habit, which is a material law. As a final practical maxim, relative to these habits of the will, we may then offer something like this. Keep the faculty of effort alive in you by a little gratuitous exercise every day. That is, be systematically ascetic or heroic in little unnecessary points. Do every day or two something for no other reason than that you would rather not do it, so that when the hour of dire need draws nigh, it may find you not unnerved and untrained to stand the test. Asceticism of this sort is like the insurance which a man pays on his house and goods. The tax does him no good at the time, and possibly may never bring him a return, but if the fire does come, his having paid it will be his salvation from ruin. So with the man who has daily inured himself to habits of concentrated attention, energetic volition, and self-denial in unnecessary things. He will stand like a tower when everything rocks around him, and when his softer fellow mortals are winnowed like chaff in the blast. End quote. So that's cool. He's talking about building habits. Again, he's talking about not letting yourself get... I think this is like one of my favorite quotes from all of his writings. So he's talking about not letting yourself getting swept up in emotions of various sorts that don't ever have any practical, actual discharge, so to speak. They don't prompt you to actually do anything. You get the feeling when you're watching a movie, and it's totally kind of, oddly unnatural, I think. You get all this swept up in all this emotional feelings watching this movie that doesn't ever prompt you to do anything, and so your emotions and your actions become disconnected. You're excited about something that you're watching, but it doesn't ever manifest in any kind of physical activity or anything. It's sort of a condemnation of entertainment that's like this passive entertainment. He even calls out excessive novel reading and theater going will produce true monsters, as he says. So that's an interesting condemnation of the inwardness of so much of entertainment. It's just like, you being distracted, constantly distracted by things. It engenders a habit of distraction, constantly letting things go when you should take action. It like builds habits of inaction. I don't know. I think that whole section is pretty cool. But moving on from habit, he talks a little bit about self-interest. This is the section on the self. I'm not going to talk an awful lot about his conversation about the self, but I just did want to touch on this one when he says, quote, "On zoological principles, it is easy to see why we have been endowed with impulses of self-seeking and with emotions of self-satisfaction and the reverse. Unless our consciousness were something more than cognitive, unless it experienced a partiality for certain of the objects which in succession occupy its ken, it could not long maintain itself in existence. For, by an inscrutable necessity, each human mind's appearance on this earth is conditioned upon the integrity of the body with which it belongs, upon the treatment which that body gets from others, and upon the spiritual dispositions which use it as their tool, and lead it either towards longevity or to destruction. Its own body, then, first of all, its friends next, and finally its spiritual dispositions must be the supremely interesting objects for each human mind. Each mind, to begin with, must have a certain minimum of selfishness in the shape of instincts of bodily self-seeking in order to exist. The minimum must be there as a basis for all farther conscious acts, whether of self-negation or of a selfishness more subtle still. All minds must have come, by the way of the survival of the fittest, if by no directer path, to take an intense interest in the bodies to which they are yoked, altogether apart from any interest in the pure ego, which they also possess, and similarly with the image of their person in the minds of others. I should not be extant now had I not become sensitive to looks of approval or disapproval on the faces among which my life is cast. Looks of contempt cast on other persons need affect me in no such particular way. My spiritual powers, again, must interest me more than those of other people, and for the same reason. I should not be here at all unless I had cultivated them and kept them from decay. And the same law, which made me once care for them, makes me care for them still. All these three things form the natural me, but all these things are objects, properly so called, to the thought which at any time may be doing the thinking. And if the zoological and evolutionary point of view is the true one, there is no reason why one object might not arouse passion and interest as primitively and instinctively as any other. The phenomenon of passion is in its origin and essence the same, whatever the target upon which it is discharged. And what the target actually happens to be is solely a question of fact. I might conceivably be as much fascinated, and as primitively so, by the care of my neighbor's body as by the care of my own. I am thus fascinated by the care of my child's body. The only check to such exuberant non-egoistic interests is natural selection, that which would weed out such as were very harmful to the individual or to his tribe. Many such interests, however, remain unweeded out. The interest in the opposite sex, for example, which seems in mankind stronger than is called for by its utilitarian need, and alongside of them remains interests like that in alcoholic intoxication or in musical sounds, which for aught we can see are without any utility whatever. The sympathetic instincts and the egoistic ones are thus coordinate. They arise, so far as we can tell, on the same psychological level. The only difference between them is that the instincts called egoistic form much the larger mass. End quote. So there's not a tremendous amount to be said about that. What he's saying about the different selves, he basically talks about three selves: the material me, the material self, the social me, or the social self. He refers to them as the me and the me's and the I. The I being the knower. I know this, right? I is the subject. Me is the thing which I know, or other people can see. They can see me, right? There are different types of me's, which are the objects of knowing, and that's the material me and the social me, and then the spiritual me, which is sort of like your moral disposition and your like bird's eye view of the whole you, your whole integral self as self-perceived. But he talks about how there's a certain selfishness which in how we prefer we prefer the me to the other people, and we have sort of a hierarchy of me's that we generally, although it's not hard and fast, without the physical me, right, nothing can proceed. So there's a sort of primariness of your physical body maintaining its aliveness. But we have to through we could hypothetically care about other people as much as we care about ourselves, but that wouldn't be efficient in a survival of the fittest scenario. One would tend to die out, as while one who is more of a self-interest would be more likely to survive and therefore replicate. So he just kind of says the basic, like, you have to understand selfishness as an evolutionarily acquired trait that all people have. I'm going to read a bit here. This is in the chapter on conception, and I'm not going to talk much about this section either, but I wanted to point it out. Something that I had always sort of noticed and thought was peculiar, and I like how he points it out. He says that, quote, "The nominalists and conceptualists carry on a great quarrel over the question whether the mind can frame abstract or universal ideas. Ideas, it should be said, of abstract or universal objects. But truly, in comparison with the wonderful fact that our thoughts, however different otherwise, can still be of the same, the question whether that same be a single thing, a whole class of things, an abstract quality, or something unimaginable, is an insignificant matter of detail. Our meanings are of singulars, particulars, indefinites, problematics, and universals, mixed together in every way. A singular individual is as much conceived, when he is isolated and identified away from the rest of the world in my mind, as is the most rarefied and universally applicable quality he may possess, being, for example, when treated in the same way. From every point of view, the overwhelming and portentous character ascribed to universal conceptions is surprising. Why, from Socrates downward, philosophers should have vied with each other in scorn of the knowledge of the particular, in adoration of that of the general, is hard to understand, seeing that the more adorable knowledge ought to be that of the more adorable things, and that the things of worth are all concretes and singulars. The only value of universal characters is that they help us by reasoning to know new truths about individual things. The restriction of one's meaning, moreover, to an individual thing probably requires even more complicated brain processes than its extension to all the instances of a kind. And the mere mystery, as such, of the knowledge is equally great whether generals or singulars be the things known. In sum, therefore, the traditional universal worship can only be called a bit of perverse sentimentalism, a philosophic idol of the cave." End quote. So what he's really saying there is that philosophers from Socrates on downward have had this obsession with universals, generals, absolutes, things which can be applied in all cases, the ideal forms, always searching for something that has a degree of permanence to it. And that's sort of, I think there's an idea in philosophy as well as in religion as well as probably everywhere that we're like tossed about at sea, and we're looking for something secure and permanent and stable that we can grab hold of, something we can know to be true, some sort of certainty of something. And maybe that's where this obsession with absolutes and universals and general traits of things in philosophy and religion and elsewhere comes about. But James is saying, maybe we ought to be, applying, the knowledge that we ought to most care about is the knowledge of the things that we most care about, and all of the things that we tend to care about in the world are the things which are, individual in particular. And I think this is important. Like all the people that you might say, geez, I wish they would live forever. But part of the reason why you care about other people in the way that you do is because you know that they're not going to be here forever. They have mortality. They're going to die. You're going to die. Your experience together with this other person whom you love the most, for example, is limited in time, and there's a sort of preciousness that comes about from the knowledge of limitation. And it's likewise in economics. The scarcity creates value. And everything is limited in the world that we, just about outside of the most abstract plane. Why are we so dismissive of the individual and the particular and so infatuated with the absolute and the universal? Is sort of the question that he's asking, and I think it's an important question, and I like the way he put it. So, but moving on from that, I want to get into instinct. Let me just, before I do, the last section I'll do will be on instinct, but I just want to touch on this section when he's talking about knowing, and I think here we can see, maybe more than anywhere else, the first stirrings of pragmatism in his writing. So here he says, quote, "Every reality has an infinity of aspects or properties. Even so simple a fact as a line, which you trace in the air, may be considered in respect to its form, its length, its direction, and its location. When we reach more complex facts, the number of ways in which we may regard them is literally endless. Vermilion is not only a mercury compound, it is vividly red, heavy, and expensive. It comes from China, and so on, ad infinitum. All objects are well springs of properties which are only little by little developed to our knowledge. And it is truly said that to know one thing thoroughly would be to know the whole universe. Mediately or immediately, the one thing is related to everything else. And to know all about it, all its relations must be known. But each relation forms one of its attributes, one angle by which someone may conceive it. And so, while conceiving it, may ignore the rest of it. A man is such a complex fact. But out of the complexity, all that an army commissary picks out as important for his purposes is his property of eating so many pounds a day, the general of marching so many miles, the chairmaker of having such a shape, the orator of responding to such and such feelings, the theater manager of being willing to pay just such a price and no more for an evening's amusement. Each of these persons singles out the particular side of the entire man which has a bearing on his concerns, and not till this side is distinctly and separately conceived can the proper practical conclusions for the reasoner be drawn, and when they are drawn, the man's other attributes may be ignored. All ways of conceiving a concrete fact, if they are true ways at all, are equally true ways. There is no property absolutely essential to any one thing. The same property which figures as the essence of a thing on one occasion becomes a very inessential feature upon another. Now that I am writing, it is essential that I conceive my paper as a surface for inscription. If I failed to do that, I should have to stop my work. But if I wished to light a fire and no other materials were by, the essential way of conceiving the paper would be as combustible material, and I need then have no thought of any of its other destinations. It is really all that it is, a combustible, a writing surface, a thin thing, a hydrocarbonaceous thing, a thing 8 inches one way and 10 another, a thing just 1 furlong east of a certain stone in my neighbor's field, an American thing, etc., etc., ad infinitum. Whichever one of these aspects of its being I temporarily class it under makes me unjust to the other aspects, but as I always am classing it under one aspect or another, I am always unjust, always partial, always exclusive. My excuse is necessity, the necessity which my finite and practical nature lays upon me. My thinking is first and last and always for the sake of my doing, and I can only do one thing at a time. A God who is supposed to drive the whole universe abreast may also be supposed, without detriment to his activity, to see all parts of it at once, and without emphasis. But were our human attention so to disperse itself, we should simply stare vacantly at things, at large, and forfeit our opportunity of doing any particular act. Mr. Warner, in his Adirondack story, shot a bear by aiming at it, not at its eye or heart, but at him generally. But we cannot aim generally at the universe, or if we do, we miss our game. Our scope is narrow, and we must attack things piecemeal, ignoring the solid fullness in which the elements of nature exist, and stringing one after another of them together in a serial way to suit our little interests as they change from hour to hour. In this, the partiality of one moment is partly atoned for by the different sort of partiality of the next. To me, now, writing these words, emphasis and selection seem to be the essence of the human mind. In other chapters, other qualities have seemed and will again seem more important parts of psychology. End quote. So, you can see the pragmatism in there. And one thing I know that when I did my previous episode on pragmatism by the same author, William James, I talked about a part of pragmatism as I see it, which is the very approximateness of knowledge. And James in that book didn't really make as much of a deal about the approximateness of knowledge. He talked about the consequentialist nature of knowledge. But I was talking a little bit about how you can never have complete and absolute knowledge of a thing. You're always sort of making a map in your mind of the real thing, and the only perfectly 100% accurate map of the world is the world. You're always dealing with an approximation of a thing in your mind that you label as truth and knowledge, but it's always partly approximate. And I think that he talked about that in here, how there is no way to have perfect knowledge of a thing because it has so many aspects and relations with other things that it's ultimately infinite, and therefore outside your capacity to know. Your knowing is simply a perspective and an approximation of a deeper, more pure, but ultimately inaccessible mode of truth. So moving from that to instinct. And the three sections I'm going to read about instinct are all pretty closely consecutive and occupies a good portion of this late chapter on instinct. Because I think it's really important to evolutionary psychology and a largely disregarded aspect of pragmatism, and so I want to point it out. So here he says, quote, "Why do the various animals do what seem to us such strange things in the presence of such outlandish stimuli? Why does the hen, for example, submit herself to the tedium of incubating such a fearfully uninteresting set of objects as a nest full of eggs, unless she has some sort of a prophetic inkling of the result? The only answer is ad hominem. We can only interpret the instincts of brutes by what we know of instincts in ourselves. Why do men always lie down when they can on soft beds rather than hard floors? Why do they sit round the stove on a cold day? Why, in a room, do they place themselves 99 times out of 100 with their faces towards its middle, rather than toward the wall? Why do they prefer saddle of mutton and champagne to hardtack and ditch water? Why does the maiden interest the youth so that everything about her seems more important and significant than anything else in the world? Nothing more can be said than that these are human ways, and that every creature likes its own ways and takes to the following them as a matter of course. Science may come and consider these ways and find that most of them are useful, but it is not for the sake of their utility that they are followed, but because at the moment of following them we feel that it is the only appropriate and natural thing to do. Not one man in a billion, when taking his dinner, ever thinks of utility. He eats because the food tastes good and makes him want more. If you ask him why he should want to eat more of what tastes like that, instead of revering you as a philosopher, he will probably laugh at you for a fool. The connection between the savory sensation and the act it awakens is for him absolute and self-evident, an a priori synthesis of the most perfect sort, needing no proof but its own evidence. It takes, in short, what Berkeley calls a mind debauched by learning, to carry the process of making the natural seem strange, so far as to ask us for the why of any instinctive human act. To the metaphysician alone can such questions occur as, why do we smile when pleased and not scowl? Why are we unable to talk to a crowd as we talk to a single friend? Why does a particular maiden turn our wits so upside down? The common man can only say, of course we smile, of course our heart palpitates at the sight of a crowd, of course we love the maiden, that beautiful soul clad in that perfect form, so palpably and flagrantly made from all eternity to be loved. And so probably does each animal feel about the particular things it tends to do in presence of particular objects. They, too, are a priori syntheses. To the lion, it is the lioness, which is made to be loved. To the bear, the she-bear. To the broody hen, the notion would probably seem monstrous that there should be a creature in the world to whom a nest full of eggs was not the utterly fascinating and precious and never to be too much sat upon object which it is to her. Thus we may be sure that, however mysterious some animals' instincts may appear to us, our instincts will appear no less mysterious to them. And we may conclude that, to the animal which obeys it, every impulse and every step of every instinct shines with its own sufficient light, and seems at the moment the only eternally right and proper thing to do. It is done for its own sake exclusively. What voluptuous thrill may not shake a fly, when she at last discovers the one particular leaf or carrion or pit of dung that out of all the world can stimulate her ovipositor to its discharge? Does not the discharge then seem to her the only fitting thing? And need she care or know anything about the future maggot and its food? Instincts are not always blind or invariable. Nothing is commoner than the remark that man differs from lower creatures by the almost total absence of instincts, in the assumption of their work in him by reason. A fruitless discussion might be waged on this point by two theorizers who are careful not to define their terms. We must, of course, avoid a quarrel about words, and the facts of the case are really tolerably plain. Man has a far greater variety of impulses than any lower animal, and any one of these impulses, taken in itself, is as blind as the lowest instinct can be. But, owing to man's memory, power of reflection, and power of inference, they come each one to be felt by him after he has once yielded to them and experienced their results in connection with a foresight of these results. In this condition, an impulse acted out may be said to be acted out, in part at least, for the sake of its results. It is obvious that every instinctive act in an animal with memory must cease to be blind after being once repeated, and must be accompanied with foresight of its end, just so far as that end may have fallen under the animal's cognizance. An insect that lays her eggs in a place where she never sees them hatched must always do so blindly. But a hen who has already hatched a brood can hardly be assumed to sit with perfect blindness on her second nest. Some expectation of consequences must in every case like this be aroused, and this expectation, according as it is that of something desired or of something disliked, must necessarily either reinforce or inhibit the mere impulse. The hen's idea of the chickens would probably encourage her to sit. A rat's memory, on the other hand, of a former escape from a trap would neutralize him of his impulse to take bait from anything that reminded him of that trap. If a boy sees a fat hopping toad, he probably has incontinently an impulse, especially if with other boys, to smash the creature with a stone, which impulse we may suppose him blindly to obey. But something in the expression of the dying toad's clasped hands suggests the meanness of the act, or reminds him of sayings he has heard about the sufferings of animals being like his own, so that when next he is tempted by a toad, the idea arises which, far from spurring him again to the torment, promptly prompts kindly actions, and may even make him the toad's champion against less reflecting boys. It is plain, then, that no matter how well endowed an animal may originally be in the way of instincts, his resultant actions will be much modified if the instincts combine with experience. If, in addition to impulses, he has memories, associations, inferences, and expectations of any considerable scale. End quote. All right, so that section there is talking about, first of all, like how self-evident they seem, that they don't need to be explained in their most base. If you think of the most basic instinct, it doesn't have to necessarily withstand a scrutiny of rationality in order to justify itself to humans. I think this is something that seems like it would be self-evident, but over time, especially when you consider instincts that get more and more buried under rational, quote-unquote, rational decision-making, or the, interference with other habits and instincts, as we'll see as we read further, or just memory, like he's talking about the rat remembering the trap, and so it withholds from its impulse to eat the cheese, right? But the impulse themselves, they're just by itself, without any considering any other factors, is generally sort of a self-evident good. Just like for a hen to sit on eggs is a self-evident good. She does it because, well, why wouldn't you sit on a nest full of eggs? It's just the obvious thing to do, and it's beneficial for the hen to sit on the eggs. It's beneficial for hen kind that the hens sit on the eggs. And so the instinct is bred into the hen, and you wouldn't expect the hen to, have to force itself to engage in a debate of whether or not to sit on the eggs. And so we approach that way things that are real obvious, like, well, why do we want to lay on something comfortable versus lay on the ground? Why do we want to eat food that tastes good as opposed to food that tastes bad or that doesn't taste like anything? There's a sort of self-evidence to it. So I think that's cool. It's at base a self-evident thing, but once you complicate things like memory and other factors in, the self-evidence of it vanishes because now you have ultimately competing drives, because when you're remembering when the rat remembers the trap, it now has to factor in an instinctive drive to avoid danger. And it has a competing drive toward cheese and also a drive toward avoiding danger. And the rat is weighing in its little mind those things. And that's kind of what he talks about more in this part here when he says, quote, "If an instinct be a mere excitomotor impulse due to the preexistence of a certain reflex arc in the nerve centers of the creature, of course it must follow the law of all such reflex arcs. One liability of such arcs is to have their activity inhibited by other processes going on at the same time. It makes no difference whether the arc be organized at birth, or ripen spontaneously later, or be due to an acquired habit. It must take its chances with all the other arcs, and sometimes succeed and sometimes fail, in drafting off the currents through itself. The mystical view of an instinct would make it invariable. The physiological view would require it to show occasional irregularities in any animal in whom the number of separate instincts and the possible entrance of the same stimulus into several of them was great. And such irregularities are what every superior animal's instincts do show in abundance. Wherever the mind is elevated enough to discriminate, wherever several distinct sensory elements may combine to discharge the reflex arc, wherever, instead of plumping into action instantly at the first rough intimation of what sort of a thing there is, an agent waits to see which one of its kind it is, and what the circumstances are of its appearance, wherever different individuals and different circumstances can impel him in different ways, wherever these are the conditions, we have a masking of the elementary constitution of the instinctive life. The whole story of our dealings with the lower wild animals is the history of our taking advantage of the way in which they judge of everything by its mere label, as it were, so as to ensnare or kill them. Nature in them has left matters in this rough way, and made them always act in the manner which would be most often right. There are more worms unattached to hooks than impaled upon them. Therefore, on the whole, nature says to her fishy children, bite at every worm and take your chances. But as her children get higher and their lives more precious, she reduces the risks. Since what seems to be the same object may now be a genuine food and now a bait, since in gregarious species each individual may prove to be either the friend or the rival, according to the circumstances of another, since any entirely unknown object may be fraught with weal or woe, nature implants contrary impulses to act on many classes of things, and leaves it to slight alterations in the conditions of the individual case to decide which impulse shall carry the day. Thus, greediness and suspicion, curiosity and timidity, coyness and desire, bashfulness and vanity, sociability and pugnacity, seem to shoot over into each other as quickly and to remain in an unstable inequilibrium in the higher birds and mammals as in man. All are impulses, congenital, blind at first, and productive of motor reactions of a rigorously determinate sort. Each one of them is an instinct, as instincts are commonly defined, but they contradict each other. Experience in each particular opportunity of an application usually deciding the issue. The animal that exhibits them loses the instinctive demeanor and appears to live a life of hesitation and choice, an intellectual life. Not, however, because he has no instincts, rather because he has so many that they block each other's path. Thus we may confidently say that, however uncertain man's reactions upon his environment may sometimes seem, in comparison with those of lower mammals, the uncertainty is probably not due to their possession of any principles of action which he lacks. On the contrary, man possesses all the impulses that they have and a great many more besides. In other words, there is no material antagonism between instinct and reason. Reason, per se, can inhibit no impulses. The only thing that can neutralize an impulse is an impulse, the other way. Reason may, however, make an inference which will excite the imagination, so as to let loose the impulse the other way. And thus, though the animal richest in reason is also the animal richest in instinctive impulses too, he never seems the fatal automaton which a merely instinctive animal must be. End quote. All right, so he was talking about how all these different impulses compete with one another. He mentions greediness and suspicion, curiosity and timidity, coyness and desire, bashfulness and vanity, sociability and pugnacity, so on and so forth. These competing instincts, and I think this is an important point to just dwell on for a moment, in that a lot of times we sort of see like government and law and maybe culture as a whole, or religion perhaps, whatever laws are imposed on man, generally this is especially true when you're looking at laws that are imposed by religious institutions. There's this idea that there's competing this animal nature, like we just without any laws we revert to our animal nature, which would just be like raping and murdering and killing each other or something, and it's law that civilizes us into properly sociable behavior. But the reality is that we have instincts toward a great many competing things, and one of our instincts is toward sociability and agreeableness, and we have instincts toward building social groups, and we have instincts toward creating reciprocity, and we have instincts toward altruism, and all of these things have come about because they've been beneficial to us or to our tribal unit. And it's not the case that our instincts are just this sort of depraved, degenerate quality of our existence. All sorts of our higher drives are also instincts. What one would refer to as higher drives, drives towards activities that are more socially conducive. And what we're doing all the time is really evaluating the multitude, not just two, but great multitude of drives that are all pushing and pulling us in various directions. And we're evaluating the chances that this course of action or that course of action will satisfy this drive or that drive, or will satisfy the most drives, or will satisfy the most drives in the most efficient manner. But it's always this competing pursuit of instincts and impulses and drives, all of which serve in one form or another to advance the genetic code. And then the last section I'm going to read is the one last section on instinct, where he talks about how instinct can compete with not only other instincts, but can compete with the physical fact of habit. He says, quote, "When objects of a certain class elicit from an animal a certain sort of reaction, it often happens that the animal becomes partial to the first specimen of the class on which it has reacted, and will not afterward react on any other specimen. The selection of a particular hole to live in, of a particular mate, of a particular feeding ground, of a particular variety of diet, a particular anything, in short, out of a possible multitude, is a very widespread tendency among animals, even those low down on the scale. The limpet will return to its same sticking place on the rock, and the lobster to its favorite nook on the sea bottom. The rabbit will deposit its dung in the same corner. The bird makes its nest on the same bough. But each of these preferences carries with it an insensibility to other opportunities and occasions, an insensibility which can only be described physiologically as an inhibition of new impulses by the habit of old ones already formed. The possession of homes and wives of our own makes us strangely insensible to the charms of those of other people. Few of us are adventurous in the matter of food. In fact, most of us think there is something disgusting in a bill of fare to which we are unused. Strangers, we are apt to think, cannot be worth knowing, especially if they come from distant cities, etc. The original impulse which got us, homes, wives, dietaries, and friends at all, seems to exhaust itself in the first achievement, and to leave no surplus energy for reacting on new cases. And so it comes about that, witnessing this torpor, an observer of mankind might say that no instinctive propensity toward certain objects existed at all. It existed, but it existed miscellaneously, or as an instinct pure and simple, only before habit was formed. A habit, once grafted onto an instinctive tendency, restricts the range of the tendency itself and keeps us from reacting on any but the habitual object, although other objects might just as well have been chosen had they been the first comers. Another sort of arrest of instinct by habit is where the same class of objects awakens contrary instinctive impulses. Here, the impulse first followed toward a given individual of the class is apt to keep him from ever awakening the opposite impulse in us. In fact, the whole class may be protected by this individual specimen from the application to it of the other impulse. Animals, for example, awaken in a child the opposite impulses of fearing and fondling. But if a child, in his first attempts to pat a dog, gets snapped at or bitten, so that the impulse of fear is strongly aroused, it may be that for years to come no dog will excite in him the impulse to fondle again. On the other hand, the greatest natural enemies, if carefully introduced to each other when young and guided at the outset by superior authority, settle down into those happy families of friends which we see in our menageries. Young animals, immediately after birth, have no instinct of fear, but showed their dependence by allowing themselves to be freely handled. Later, however, when they grow wild, and if left to themselves, will not let man approach them. End quote. Okay, so that was not a particularly long section, but just the basic premise that once a habit begins to be formed, it's invariably blocking off other potential activities which would have otherwise been undertaken on account of the various impulses that would drive one to those activities. And so as a habit is formed, you're basically saying, I'm going to respond in this particular way to this particular impulse, but I'm not going to respond in other ways or to other potential stimuli that would trigger that impulse. Only this particular stimuli, because that's the habit I've formed. So, I think it's cool that the emphasis that he places on instinct, the interaction of instinct and habit, and a real sort of deterministic quality runs through it. He does talk a little about free will, but his approach to free will is kind of odd. He actually proclaimed at one point that his first true act of free will was to believe in free will. So it's kind of self-referential, but in looking at the book, so much is given over to materialistic, deterministic processes. And it's only sort of a sliver of consciousness that he even allows to be the home, the hiding space of free will. But he says that to look at psychology from a scientific perspective, you really have to assume total determinism. That's what makes it a science. If it was not, to all the extents to which it's not deterministic, that's the extent to which it's no longer a science, because it can't be predicted reliably. So anyway, there's that, and actually next episode this is like one of the first books that ever could really be tagged as part of the pragmatic au revoir And I want to look near, in the next episode at something that was much later, toward the end of John Dewey's life, when we'll see where things sort of wound up. And it's in a very different place from where it begins. So come back next time for more exploration of pragmatism. Bye now.